Okay, chapter 1. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Winston Smith, his chin nuzzled into his breast in an effort to escape the vile wind, slipped quickly through the glass doors of Victory Mansions, though not quickly enough to prevent a swirl of gritty dust from entering along with him. The hallway smelt of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. At one end of it, colored posters too large for indoor display had been tacked to the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face more than a meter wide. The face of a man of about 45 with a heavy black mustache and ruggedly handsome features. Winston made for the stairs. It was no use trying to lift. Even at the best of times, it was seldom working, and at present, the electric current was cut off during daylight hours. It was part of the economy drive in preparation for a hate week. The flat was 7 flights up, and Winston, who was 39 and had Vickers ulcer above his right ankle, went slowly, resting several times on the way. On each landing opposite the lift shaft, the poster with the enormous face gazed from the wall. It was one of those pictures which are so contrived that the eyes follow you about when you move. Big Brother is watching you, the caption beneath it ran. Inside, a flat and fruitery voice was reading out a list of figures which had something to do with the production of pig iron. The voice came from oblong metal plaque like a dulled mirror from formed part of surface of the right hand wall. Winston turned the switch and the voice sank somewhat through the words were still distinguishable. The instrument, the telescreen, it was called, could be dim, but there was no way of shutting it off completely. He moved over to the window, a smallish, frail figure of the meanings of his body, merely emphasized by the blue overalls which were in form of the party. His hair was very fair, his face naturally sagging, his skin roughened by coarse soap and blunt razor blades, and the cold of the winter had just ended. Outside, even through the shut window pane, the world looked cold. Down the street, little eddies of the wind were whirling dust and torn papers into spirals, and through the sun was shining in the sky, a harsh blue. There seemed to be no color in anything except the posters that were plastered everywhere. The black mustachioed face gazed down from every commanding corner. There was one in the house front directly opposite. Big Brother is watching you, the caption said, while the Dirk Arls looked deep into Winston's own down at street level. Another poster torn one corner flapped fruitfully in the wind, alternately uncovering the single word INGSOC, all caps. In the far distance, a helicopter skimmed down between the roofs, hovered for an instant like a blue bottle, darted away with a carving flight. It was the police patrol snooping into people's windows. The patrol did not matter, however, only the thought police mattered. Behind Winston's back, the voice from the telescreen was still babbling about pig iron and the overfulfillment of the ninth 3-year plan. The telescreen received or transmitted simultaneously. Any sound that Winston made above the level of the very low whisper would be picked up by it. More so over so long he remained within the field of vision. With the metal plaque commanded he could be seen well as heard. There were there was, of course, no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment. How often or what system thought the police plugged in or any individual wire was guesswork. It was even convincible that they watched everybody all the time. But at any rate, they could plug in your wire whenever they wanted to. You had to did live from habit that became instinct, in the assumption that every sound that you made was overheard and except in darkness, every movement scrutinized. Winston kept back turned to his telescreen. It was safer though, as he well knew even a bat can be revealing. A kilometer away from the Minister of Truth, his place of work towered vast of the white above the grimy landscape. This he thought with a sort of vague distaste. This was London chief city, airstrip one itself, the third most populous of the prominence of Oceania. He tried to squeeze of somewhat childhood memory that should tell him whether London had always been quite like this, where there are always this vistas of rotten 19th century houses, there shored up with balks of timber, their windows patched with cardboard, and their roofs corroded iron, their crazy garden walls sagging in all directions, and the bum sites where the plaster durl swirled in the air, and the willow herb straggled over the heaps of rubble. In the places where the bombs had cleared a larger path, and there sprung up sordid colonies of wooden dwellings like chicken houses, but it was no use. He could not remember nothing remained of his childhood except a series of bright light tableaux occurring against no background and mostly unintelligible. The ministry of truth, ministry, in the new speed was startlingly different from any other object in sight. It was enormous, pyramidal structure of glittering white concrete soaring up terrace after terrace with hundreds of meters into the air. From where Winston stood, it was just possible to read, picked out a white face in elegant lettering, the three slogans of the party: war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. The Ministry of Truth contained, that it was said, 3,000 rooms above ground level, and the corresponding ramifications below. Scattered above London, there were just three other buildings of similar appearance and size. Not completely did they dwarf the surrounding architecture, that from the roof of Victory Mansions you could see all four of them simultaneously. There were the homes of four ministries, between which the entire apparatus of government was divided. The Minister of Truth, which concerned itself with news, entertainment, education, and the fine arts. The Ministry of Peace, which concerned itself with war. The Ministry of Love, which maintained law and order. And the Ministry of Plenty, which was responsible for economic affairs. Their names in news speak: miniature, mini-packs, mini-love, and mini-plenty. The Ministry of Love was really frightening one. There were no windows in it at all. Winston had never been inside the Ministry of Love, nor within half a kilometer of it. It was a place impossible to enter except on official business, and then only by penetrating through a maze of barbed wire entanglements still down in hidden machine gun rests. Even the streets leading up to its outer barriers was roamed by gorilla-faced guards in black uniforms armed with jointed tretrons. Winston turned round abruptly. He had set features into the expressions of quiet optimism, which it is added visibly to where, when facing the telescreen, he crossed the room into a tiny kitchen. By leaving the ministry at this time of day, he had sacrificed his lunch in the canteen, and he was aware that there was no food in the kitchen except a hunk of dark-colored bread, which had got to be saved for tomorrow's breakfast. He took down the shelf a bottle of colorless liquor with plain white labeled marked Victory Gin. It gave off a sickly, oily smell as Chinese rice spirit. Winston poured out nearly a teacup near himself for a shock and gulped it down, a dose of medicine. Instantly his face turned scarlet and the water ran out of his eyes. The stuff was like nitric acid, and more than swallowing it, one had a sensation of being hit one back head with a rubber club. The next moment, however, the burning of his belly died down and the rub began to look cheerful. He took a cigarette from the crumpled pack marked Victory cigarettes and unconsciously held it upright, where upon the tobacco fell out onto the floor. With the next he was more successful. He went back to the living room and sat down with a small table that stood on the left of the telescreen. From the table drawer, he took out a pen holder, a bottle of ink, a thick quarter-sized blank book with a red back and a marbled cover. For some reason, the telescreen in the living room was in an unusual position. Instead of being placed as was normal in the end wall where it could command the whole room, it was in a longer wall opposite of the window. The one side of it there was a shallow alcove in which Winston was now sitting, in which the flats were built had probably been intended to hold bookshelves by sitting in the alcove, keeping well back. Winston was able to remain outside the range of the telescreen. Excuse me. So far as sight went, he could hear it, of course, but so long he stayed in the present position, he could not be seen. It was partly the unusual geography of the room that suggested to him the thing that was now about to do. But it had also been suggested by the book that he had just taken out of the drawer. It was a peculiar, beautiful book. A smooth, creamy paper, little yellowed by age, was a kind of that had not been manufactured for 40 years of past. He could guess, however, the book was much older than that. He had seen it lying around the window of Frozy little junk shop in a slumbery quarter of town, just what the quarter he did not remember. And he had been strictly immediately by an overwhelming desire to possess it. Party members were supposed not to go into ordinary shops dealing with a free market, it was called, but the rule was not strictly kept because there were various things such as shoelaces and razor blades which was impossible to get a hold of anywhere else. He had given a quick glance up and down the street and slipped inside the book for $2.50. In time, he was not conscious of what it particular proposed. He had carried it guiltily home in a briefcase. Even with nothing written in it, it was compromising possession. The thing that he was about to do to an open diary, this was not illegal. Nothing was illegal since there were no longer any laws, but he detected it was reasonable certain that it would be punished by death or at least by 25 years by forced labor camp. Winston fitted a nib into a pen holder and sucked it, get the grease off. The pen was an Ariat in strength, seldom used even for signatures, and he had one figuratively, and some simply because of the feeling that the beautiful creamy paper deserved to be written on with a real nib instead of being scratched with a ink pencil. Actually, he was not used to writing by hand. Apart from very short notes, it was usual to dictate everything into the speak right, which was of course impossible for his present purpose. He dipped the pen into the ink and then faltered for just a second. The trimmer had gone through his bowels to mark the paper was decisive act. Its small, clumsy letters wrote, April 4th, 1984. He sat back. A sense of complete helplessness had descended upon him. To begin with, he did not know with any certainty that this was 1984. It must be rounded about that day since he was fairly sure that his age was 39, and he believed that he had been born in 1944 or 1945. But it was never possible nowadays to pin down any date within a year or two. For whom it suddenly occurred to him to wonder, was he writing this diary for the future, for the unborn? His mind hovered for a moment round the doubtful date on the page and then fetched up with a bump against the Newsweek word, double think. For the first time, the magnitude of what he had undertaken came home with him. How could you communicate with the future? It was of its nature impossible. Either the future would resemble the present, in which case it would not listen to him, or it would be different from it, and his predicament would be meaningless. For some time he sat gazing stupidly at the paper. The telescreen had changed over stridently military music. It was curious that he seemed not merely to have lost the power of expressing himself, but even had forgotten what it was he had originally intended to say. For weeks past he had been making ready for this moment. had never crossed his mind that anything would be needed except courage. The actual writing would be easy. All he had to do was to transfer to paper the interminable restlessness monologue that he had been running inside his head literally for years. At this moment, however, even the monologue had dried up. Moreover, his Vickers ulcer had begun itching and barely. He dared not scratch it because if he did so, it always became inflamed. The seconds were ticking by. He was conscious of nothing except the blankness of the page in front of him, the itching of the skin above his ankle, and the blaring of the music, and the slight booziness caused by the gin. Suddenly he began writing a sheer panic, only imperfectly aware of what he was setting down. His small but childish handwriting straggled up down the page, shedding first its capital letters and then finally even its full stops. April 4th, 1984, last night to the flicks. All war films, one very good one of a ship full of refugees being bombed somewhere in the Mediterranean, audience much amused by shots of great huge fat man trying to swim away with the helicopter after him. First you saw him wallowing along the water like a porpoise, then you saw him through the helicopter's gun sights, then he was full of holes in the sea, round turned pink, and sank suddenly as the holes had let him in the water. Audience shouting with laughter. He sank, then you saw a lifeboat full of children with a helicopter hovering over it. There was a middle-aged woman, might have a Jew sitting up in the boat with a little boy about 3 years old in her arms, little boy screaming with a fright of hiding head between her breasts. If he was trying to borrow right in her, the woman putting her arms around him to comfort him, although she was blue with fright herself. The time covering up as much as possible as if she thought her arms could keep the bullets off him. Then the helicopter planted a 20-kilo bomb, and among them, terrific flash, the boat went all matchwood. Then there was a wonderful shot of child's arms going upright, up into the air. A helicopter with a cameraman in its nose must have followed it up. There was a lot of applause from the party seats, but the woman in the down part of the house suddenly started kicking up a fuss and shouting. They didn't oughter of shout. Not in the front of the kids. They didn't. It ain't right. Not in front of the kids. It ain't until the police turn her out. I don't suppose anything happened to her. Nobody cares what the paroles say. Typically, parole reactions, they never. Winston stopped writing partly because he was suffering from cramp. He did not know what had made him pour out the stream of rubbish, but curious thing was while he was doing so, totally different memory had clarified itself in his mind to this point where it was almost felt equal to writing down. It was he now realized because of this other incident that he had suddenly decided to come home and begin to diary today. It had happened that morning in the ministry. If anything so nebulous could be said to happen, it was nearly 1100 in the records department where Winston worked. They were dragging the chairs out of the cubics and grouping them into the center of the hall opposite of the big telescreen in preparation for the two ministries. Hey, Winston was just thinking Winston was just taking his place in one of the middle rows when two people whom he knew by sight he had never spoken to came unexpectedly into the room. One of them was a girl whom was often passed in the corridors. He did not know her name, but he knew that she worked in the fiction department. Presumably, since he had sometimes seen her with oily hands and carrying a spanner, she had some mechanical job of one of the novel writing machines. She was a bold looking girl of about 27 with a thick, hard, freckled face and swift, athletic movements. A narrow scarlet sash emblazoned a junior anti-sex league was wounded several times around the waist of her overalls, just tightly enough to bring out the shamelessness of her hips. Winston had disliked her from the very first moment of seeing her. He knew the reason. It was because of the atmosphere of hockey fields, in cold baths, and the community hikes, and the general clean mindedness which she managed to carry about with her. He disliked nearly all women, and especially the young and pretty ones. It was always the women, and above all, the young ones, who were the most beguiled adherents of the party, the swallowers of slogans, the amateur spies, and the Norses out of unorthodoxy. But this particular girl gave him the impression of being more dangerous than most. Once, when they passed in the corridor, she had given him a quick sidelong glance which seemed to pierce right into him, and for a moment had filled him with a black terror. The idea had even crossed his mind that she might be an agent of the thought police. That it was true was very unlikely. Still, he continued to feel a peculiar uneasiness which had fear him, fear mixed up in him, as well as hostility. Whenever she was anywhere near him, the other person was a man named O'Brien, a member of the inner party, a holder of some post so important and remote that Winston had only too dim idea of his nature. A momentary hush passed over the group of people round the chairs as they saw the black overalls of an inner party member approaching. O'Brien was a large, burly man with a thick neck, of coarse, humorous, brutal face. In spite of his formidable appearance, he had a certain charm of manner. He had a thick of wrestling, and his spectacles on his nose which was curiously disarming. In some indefinable way, curiously civilized, it was a gesture which, if anyone had still thought in such terms, might have recalled an 18th century nobleman offering his snuff box. Winston had seen O'Brien perhaps a dozen times in almost as many years. He felt deeply drawn to him, and not solely because he was intrigued by the contrast between O'Brien's urban manner and his prize fighter's physique. Much more, it was because of a secretly held belief, or perhaps not even a belief, merely a hope, that O'Brien's political orthodoxy was not perfect. Something his face suggested it irresistibly, and again, perhaps it was not even unorthodoxy that was written in his face, but simply intelligence. But at any rate, he had appearance of being a person that you could talk to. If someone you could cheat the telescreen and get him alone, Winston had never made the smallest effort to verify this guess. Indeed, there was no way of doing so. At this moment, O'Brien glanced at the wristwatch, saw it was nearly 1100, and evidently decided to stay at the record department until the 2 minutes hate was over. He took his chair in the same row, and Winston had a couple places away. A small, sandy-haired woman who worked in the next cubic Winston was between them. The girl with the dark hair was sitting immediately behind. The next moment, a hideous, gritting screech as of some monstrous machine running without oil burst from the big telescreen at the end of the room. It was the noise that set one's teeth on the edge and the bristle the hair at the back of one's neck. The hate had started. Excuse me. As usual, the face Emmanuel Goldstein, the enemy of the people, had flashed onto the screen. There was hisses here and there among the audience. The little sandy-haired woman gave a squeak mingled fear of disgust. Goldstein was the renegade of the backslider who once, long ago, how long ago, nobody quite remembered, he had been one of the leading figures of the party, almost on a level with Big Brother himself. Then he engaged in counter-revolutionary activities, had condemned to death, and mysteriously escaped and disappeared. The program of the 2 minutes hate varied from day to day, and there was none in which Goldstein was not principal figure. He was the principal traitor, the earliest defiler of the party's purity. All subsequent crimes against the party, all treacheries, acts of sabotage, hearsay, evasions, sprang directly out of his teaching. Somewhere or other, he was still alive and haunching his conspiracies, perhaps somewhere beyond the sea, under the protection of his foreign paymasters, perhaps even so it was occasionally rumored in some hiding place in Oceania itself. Excuse me. Get something to drink. Excuse me. Williamson's diaphragm was constricted. He could never see the face of Goldstein without a painful mixture of emotions. It was a lean, a Jewish face with a great fuzzy Earl of white hair and a small golden beard, clever face, and yet somehow inherently despicable was a kind, sensile sourness in along with the nose near with the end of the pair of spectacles was perched. It resembled the face of a sheep, and the voice too had sheep-like quality. Goldstein's were delivering in his unusual venomous attack upon the doctrines of the party, and the attack so exaggerated and perverse that a child should have been able to see through it, and yet just plausible enough to fill one with a alarm feeling that other people less level-headed than oneself might be taken in by it. He was abusing Big Brother. He was denouncing the dictatorship of the party. He was demanding the immediate conclusion of peace. With Eurasia, he was advocating freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of the assembly, freedom of the thought. He was carrying hysterically that the revolution had been betrayed. And all this in rapid cyclist speech was a sort of parody of habitual style of the orators of the party. And even contained newspeak words. More newspeak words indeed than any party member was normally used in real life, and all the while, lest one should be in any doubt as to the reality which Goldstein's specious claptrap covered behind his head on telescreen, there marched the endless columns of the Eurasian army, row after row of solid-looking men with expressionless Asiatic faces, whom swarm up to the surface of the screen and vanish to be replaced by others exactly similar. The dull, rhythmic tramp of the soldiers' boots formed in the background to Goldstein's bleeding voice. Before the hate had proceeded for 30 seconds, uncontrollably exclamations of rage were breaking out from the half peoples in the room. The self-satisfied sheep-like face on the screen and the terrifying power of the Eurasian army behind it were too to be borne. Besides, the sight or even the thought of Goldstein produced fear and anger automatically. He was an object of hatred more constant than either Eurasia or Eurasia. Since when Oceania was at war in one of these powers, it was generally at peace with another. But that was strange. Was the odd thought that Goldstein was hated and despised by everybody, although every day, 1,000 times a day, platforms on the telescreen and the newspaper and books and the theories were refuted, smashed, ridiculed, held up to general gaze for the pitiful, rubbish, and there were, in spite of all, and the influence never seemed to grow less. Always there were fresh dupes waiting to be subdued by him. A day never passed when the spies of the sabotagers acted under the directions were not unmasked by the thought police. He was the commander of a very vast, shadowy army, an underground network conspirators dedicated to overthrow of the state. The Brotherhood, it was named, was supposed to be. There was also whispered stories of the terrible book, a compendium of all heresies, of which Goldstein was the author, of which circulated clandestinely here and there. It was a book without a title. People referred to it, if at all, simply as the book. But one knew of such things, although through vague rumors, neither the Brotherhood nor the book was a subject that ordinary part member would mention if there was a way of avoiding it. In its seconds, minutes of the hate rose to a frenzy. People were leaping up and down their places, shouting at the tops of their voices in effort to drown the mattering, bleating voice that came to the screen. The little sandy-haired woman had turned bright pink and her mouth was opening and shutting like a landed fish. Even O'Brien's heavy face was flushed. He was sitting very straight in his chair, his powerful chest swelling, quivering, as though there was standing up to an assault of wave. The dark-haired girl, Bewine Hinston, began crying out, "Swine, swine, swine!" And suddenly she picked up a heavy Newspeak dictionary and flung it at the screen. It struck Goldstein's nose, then bounced off. The voice continued inexorably. In a lucid moment, Winston found that he was shouting with the others and kicking his heel violently against the rug in the chair. The horrible thing about the 2 minutes he was not that one was obliged to act a part, but that was impossible to avoid joining in. It was impossible to avoid joining in. Within 30 seconds, any pretense was always unnecessary. A hideous ecstasy of fear and vindictiveness and desire to kill, a torture to smash faces, and a sledgehammer seemed to flow through the whole group like an electric current, through even against the will into the grimace. Screaming luniacs. And yet the rage that one felt in abstract, unidentified emotions which could be switched to another like a flame blow lamp. Thus, at one moment, Winston hated was not turned against Goldstein at all, but on the contrary against Big Brother, the party and the thought police. And at such moments in his heart went out the lonely, decidable Herrick on the screen, sole guardian of the true sanitary of the world's of lies. And yet, the very next instant he was at this one with the people about him, and all that was said about Goldstein seemed to be true. At those moments, his secret loathing of Big Brother changed into adoration, and Big Brother seemed to tower up an invincible, fearless protector, standing like a rock against the hordes of Asia. And Goldstein, in spite of his isolation, his helplessness, and the doubt that hung, upon his very existence, seemed like some sinister enchanter capable by the mere power of his voice, reckoning the structure of civilization. It was even possible at this moment to switch one's hatred with the way, or that by a voluntary act settling by the sort of violent effort with which one wrenches one's heads away from the pillow in a nightmare. Winston succeeded in transferring his hatred from face on the screen to dark-haired girl behind him. Vivid, beautiful hellaciousness flashed through his mind. He would flog her to death with a rubber trench on. He would tie her naked to a stake and shoot her full of arrows like Saint Sebastian. He would ravish her and cut her throat at the moment of climax. Better than before, moreover, he realized why it was that he hated her. He hated her because she was young and pretty and sexless, because he wanted to go to bed with her and would never do so, because round her sweet, supple waist, which seemed to ask you to encircle it with your arm, there was only audacious scarlet sash, aggressively symbol of chastity. The hate rose to its climax. The voice of Goldstein. Well, I'm gonna stop at 30 minutes. I'm gonna do 30-minute segments, man, because I'm really not that fast of a reader. I'm on page 15, but I read real fast in my head. But I'm gonna stop at 30 minutes because I feel like 30 minutes is enough for a video. And then my next video, we will be starting where I left off, about him hating the woman. The hate rose to its climax. The voice of Goldstein had become an actual sheep's bleat. And for an instant, the face changed into that of a sheep. Then the sheep's face melted into the figure of a soldier who seemed to be advancing, huge and terrible, his submachine gun roaring and seeming to spring out the surface of the screen, so that some of the people in front of the row actually flinched backwards in their seats. By the same moment, drawing a deep sigh of relief from everybody, the hostile figure melted into the face of Big Brother. Black haired, black mustached, full of power and mysterious, calm, and so vast that it almost filled up the screen. Nobody heard what Big Brother was saying. It was merely a few words in courage of sort of words that uttered in a din of battle, not distinguishable individually, but restoring confidence by the fact of being spoken. Then the face of Big Brother faded away again, and instead their three slogans of party stood out in the bold capitals: war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is slavery. That's page 16. And we will start on page 17 in the next video. Well, it's still a little bit on page 16. I'm going to try if I can read it in try to get 35 minutes. I got 26. But the face of Big Brother seemed to persist for several seconds of the screen through the impact it had made on everyone's eyeballs. The were too vivid where immediately the little shady-haired woman flung herself forward and back. The chair in front of us tremendously murmur that sounded like my savior. She extended her arms toward the screen. Then she buried her face into the impairment that she was uttering a prayer. At this moment, the crowd group of people broke into a deep rhythmical chant, B, 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 over and over again, very slowly. Long pause between the beat. The second, a heavy murmurous sound had curiously savaged the background of which one seemed to stamp a negative throbbing of tones. For perhaps 30 seconds, it kept up, and the refrain of often moments overwhelming emotions, partly the song hymn, hideous, majestic of Big Brother was still. It was act of self-hypnosis and deliberate drowning of consciousness by any means rhythmic noise. Winston entitles and trails seemed to grow cold. Page 17. Okay, back where we left off. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. But the face of Big Brother seemed to persist for several seconds on the screen as though the impact that it had made on everyone's eyeballs were too vivid to wear off immediately. The little shady-haired woman had flung herself forward, the back of the chair in front of her, with a tremendous murmur that sounded like my savior. She extended her arms toward the screen, then she buried her face in her hands. It was apparent that she was uttering a prayer. At this moment, the entire group of the people broke into a deep, slowly rhythmic chant of B, 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 over and over again, very slowly with a long pause between the first B and the second. A heavy murmurous sound, somehow curiously savage in the background of which one seemed to hear the stamp of naked feet of the throbbing tom-toms. Perhaps as much as 30 seconds they kept it up. It was a refrain that was often heard in the moments of overwhelming emotion, partly in a sort of hymn to the wisdom and majestic of Big Brother, with still more it was an act of self-hypnosis, a deliberate drowning of consciousness by means of rhythmic noise. Winston and Trails seemed to grow cold. In the 2 minutes, hate, page 17. He could not sharing in the general delirium, but the subliminal chanting of BB, BB, always filled him with horror. Of course, he chanted with the rest. It was impossible to do otherwise. To dissemble your feelings, to control your face, to do what everyone else was doing was an instinctive reaction. But there was a space of a couple of seconds during the expression in which eyes might conceivably have betrayed him. It was exactly at this moment that the significant thing, if indeed it did happen. Momentarily, he caught O'Brien's eyes. O'Brien had stood up. He had taken off his spectacles and was in the act of resettling them on his nose with a characteristic gesture. But there was a friction of second. With their eyes met for as long as it took happen, Winston's eyes, yes, he knew that O'Brien was thinking the same thing as himself. An unmistakable message had passed. It was though their two minds had opened and thoughts were flying from into the other through their eyes. I am with you, O'Brien seemed to be saying to him. I know precisely what you are feeling. I know all about your contempt, your hatred, your disgust, but don't worry, I am on your side. And then the flash of intelligence was gone, and O'Brien's face was as scrupulous as everyone else's. That was all, and he was already uncertain whether it had happened. Such incidents never had any sequel. All that did was to keep alive in him the belief or hope that others besides him were the enemies of the party. Perhaps the rumors of vast underground conspiracies was true, or perhaps the Brotherhood really existed. It was impossible, in spite of the endless RS confessions of executives, to be sure that the Brotherhood was not simply a myth. Some days he believed in it, some days he did not. There was no evidence, only fleeting glimpse that he might even anything, or if nothing, snatches or overheard conversations, faint scrambles on laboratory walls. Once even when two strangers met, a small movement of hands which had looked as though it might have signal of recognition. It was all guesswork. Very likely he had imagined everything he had back to his cubic without looking at O'Brien again. The idea of following up the momentary contact hardly crossed his mind. It would never been inconceivable dangerous even if he had known how to set about doing it. For a second, 2 seconds, they had exchanged a equivalent glance, and that was the end of the story. But even that memorable event in the loneliness in which one had lived, Winston roused himself and sat up straighter. He let out a belch. The gin was raising from his stomach. His eyes refocused on the page. He discovered that while he sat helplessly musing, he had also writing, as though by automatic action, and it was no longer the same cramped, awkward handwriting as before. His pen had slid voluptuously over the smooth paper, printing in large, neat capitals. Down with Big Brother. 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 Over and over again, filling half a page. He could not help feeling a twinge of panic. It was a bruise, since the writing of those particular words was not more dangerous than the initial act of opening the diary. But for a moment, he was tempted to tear out the spoiled pages and abandon the entire enterprise altogether. But he did not do so, however, because he knew that it was useless. Whether he wrote down Big Brother or whether he refrained from writing it made no difference. Whether he was writing on his diary or whether he did not go on with it made no difference. The thought police would get him in just the same, all the same. He had committed, would still have committed, even if he never set the pen to paper. The essential crime that contained in all others itself, the thought crime, they called it thought crime, was not a thing that could be concealed forever. You might dodge successfully for a while, even for years, but sooner or later, we're bound to get you. It was always a night. The arrest invariably happened at night. The sudden jerk out of a sleep, the rough hand shaking your shoulders, the lights glaring in your eyes, the ring of hard faces round in the bed. In the vast majority of cases, there was no trial, no report or arrest. People simply disappeared always during the night. Your name was removed from the registers. Every record of everything you had ever done was wiped out. Your one time existence was denied and then forgotten. You were abolished, annihilated, vaporized was the usual word. For a moment, he was seized by a kind of hysteria. He began writing in his hurried, utterly scrawl. They'll shoot me. I don't care. They'll shoot me in the back of the neck. I don't care. Down with Big Brother. They always shoot you in the back of the neck. I don't care with Big Brother. I don't care with Big Brother. He sat in the back of his chair, slightly ashamed of himself. He laid down his pen. The next moment, he started violently. There was a knocking at the door. Already, the knocking had still aroused him. It was still a mouse, in the futile hope that, however, it might have go away. Simply attempt, but no. The knocking was repeated. The worst thing of all would be delay. His heart was thumping like a drum, but his face, from long habit, was probably expressionless. He got up and moved heavily towards the door. As he put his hand on the doorknob, Winston saw that he had left a diary open on the table. Down with Big Brother was written all over it, in letters almost big enough to be legible to read across the room. It was an inconceivably stupid thing he had done, but he realized every instant in his panic he wanted smudge the creamy paper and shutting the book while the ink was wet. He drew his breath and opened the door. Instantly, warm wave relief flowed through him. A coreless, crushed-looking woman, a wispy hair-lined face, was standing outside. "Oh, comrade," she began to dreary, whiny sort of voice. "I thought I heard you come in. Do you think you could come across and I have to look at our kitchen sink? It's got blocked up." It was Miss Parsons, the wife of a neighbor on the same floor. Miss was a word somewhat discontinued by the party. You were supposed to call everyone comrade. But with some women, one used instinctively. She was a woman of about 30, but she was looking much older. One had impressions that was dust the seeds of her face. Winston followed her down the passage. These amateur repair jobs were an almost daily irritation. Victory mansions were old flats built in 1930 or thereabouts and were falling to pieces. The plaster flanked constantly from ceilings and walls. The pipes burst, and every hard frost the roof leaked. Whenever there was snow, The heating system was usually running on half steam when it was closed down altogether from motives of economy. Repairs except you could do for yourself had to be sanctioned by remote committees that were liable to hold up every mending of the window pane for 2 years. Excuse me. Excuse me. Of course, it's only because Tom isn't home, said Miss Parsons vaguely. The Parsons flat was bigger than Winston's in the dining in a different way. Everything had battered, trampled, looked as though the place had been visited on some large, violent animal games impediment. Hockey sticks, boxing gloves, a burst football, pair of sweaty shorts turned inside out, lay all over the floor. And on the table there was a litter of diary dishes, a dog entered exercise book. On the walls were scarlet banners of Youth League and Spies and a full-size poster of Big Brother. There was usually boiled cabbage smell coming to the whole building, but it was a shot through the sharper's neck, reek of sweat, which one knew this at first sniff, though it was hard to say how. Was the sweat of some person not present at the moment? In another room, somehow, with a comb, a piece of toilet paper, trying to keep tune with the military music, which was still issuing through the telescreen? It's the children, said Miss Parsons, casting a half apprehensive glance at the door. They haven't been out today, and of course, she had the habit of breaking off her sentences in the middle of the kitchen sink and fully nearly brim of filthy, greenish water which smelt worse than ever of cabbage. Winston knelt down and examined the angled joint of the pipe. He hated using his hands, and he hated bending down, which was always liable to start him coughing. Miss Parsons looked on him helplessly. Of course, if Tom was home, he'd put it right on in, ain't in a minute, she said. He loves anything like that. He's ever so good with his hands, that old Tom. Parsons was Winston's fellow employee at the Ministry of the Truth. He was the fattest but active man of paralyzing stupidity, a mass of imbecile enthusiasms, one of those completely unquestioned, devoted drudges on who more even than on the thought police. The stability of the party depended. At 35. He had just been unwillingly evicted from the Youth League, and before graduating to the Youth League, he had managed to stay on the Spices for a year beyond the statutory age. At the minister, he was employed in some subordinate post of which intelligence was not required. But on the other hand, he was leading figure of the sports committee and all the other committees engaged in other organizations, committees, hikes, spontaneous demonstrations, saving, campaigns, and voluntary activities. Generally, he would inform you with quite pride between whiffs of his pipe that he had put in an appearance at the committee center every evening for the past 4 years. An overpowering smell of sweat, a sort of unconscious testimony to the strenuousness of his life, followed him about whenever he went, even remained behind him as he had gone. Have you got a spanner? Said Winston, fiddling with the nut on the angle joint. A spanner, said Miss Parsons, is immediately becoming invertebrate. I don't know, I'm sure perhaps the children. They was just trampling of boots, and another blast on the comb of the children charged into the living room. Miss Parsons brought the spanner. Winston let out of water and disgustedly removed the cloth human hair that had bogged up the pipe. He cleaned his fingers as best as he could, water from the tap, and went back into the other room. Up with your hands, yelled a savage voice. A handsome, tough-looking boy of 9 had popped up from behind the table and was menacing him with a toy automatic pistol, while his small sister, about 2 years younger, made the same gesture with a fragment of wood. Both of them was dressed in a blue shorts, gray shirts, and a red neckerchief. What's a neckerchief? Which were the uniform of the Spies. Winston raised his hands above his head, but uneasy, feeling so vicious was the boy's demeanor that it was not altogether a game. You're a traitor, yelled the boy. You're a thought criminal. You're a Eurasian spy. I'll shoot you. I'll vaporize you. I'll send you to the salt mines. Suddenly, they were both leaping around him shooting traitor and thought criminal. The little girl in, imitating her brother in every moment. It was somehow slightly frightening, like the gambling of tiger cubs, which would soon grow up into man eaters. There was a sort of calculating ferocity in the boy's eyes, a quite evident desire to hit or kick Winston, and a consciousness of being very nearly big enough to do so. It was a good job. It was not a real pistol he was holding, Winston thought. Miss Parsons' eyes flitted nervously from Winston to the children and back again. In the better light of the living room, he noticed with the interest that there actually was dust in the creases of her face. They do get noisy, she said, that disappoint because they couldn't go to see the hanging. That's what it is. I'm too busy to take them, and Tom won't be back from work in time. Why can't we go to see the hanging? Roared the boy. His huge voice, want to see him hanging, want to see him hanging, chanting the little girl, still campering around. Some Eurasian prisoners guilty of war crimes were to be hanged in the park that evening, Winston remembered. This happened about once a month, and it was popular spectacle. Children had always clamored to be taken to see. He took his leave of Miss Parsons and made for the door, but he had not gone 6 steps down the passage when someone hit the back of his neck, pain, agonizingly painful blow. It was as though a red-hot wire had been jabbed into him. He spun around just to see Miss Parsons dragging her son into the back doorway while they boy pocketed a catapult. Goldstein